Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 2, and this is going to be session 15. Just to make sure that we're following this along, let me just, because we've come to a very important aspect of our sanctification, that aspect of learning to live out of that sanctification and learning to live by grace, because the last thing we encountered was that exhortation about the law that raised an objection. In fact, let me just show it to you. In verse 14, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under the law, but under grace." And Paul knows as soon as someone reads that verse, there's going to be an objection raised in their mind. Wait a minute, we're not under the law, but under grace. Because really the only way, until you're taught about it, the only way you know how to live for God is by some law or some set of rules or a list of do's and don'ts. And it doesn't strike us obviously how to live out of grace. And Paul anticipates that. And so he says in verse 15, "What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? God forbid." Paul knows that not living under the law is not a license to sin. That's what people think. They think that the law is what gives them the power to overcome sin, and the law also gives them the power to produce righteousness, and neither one of those is true. Verse 16, "Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, His servants ye are to whom ye obey, rather of sin unto death, or of obedience unto righteousness." According to verse 16, and of course I'm just running through these to catch us up, look, we have a choice now concerning who we're going to obey. We're either going to serve sin or we're going to serve righteousness. And we have a choice, whereas before we didn't. And that's the difference. Before you couldn't produce righteousness. Talking about before you were saved. You might have done good things, but they were not acceptable to God. We're going to talk about that again in just a little bit. But verse 17, "But God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you." Under our old identity in Adam, we were servants of sin, and folks, we didn't have any other option. No matter what we did, you could do charitable work, you could give to the poor, you could live sacrificially for the benefit of someone else, you could be nice, you could be honest, you could not steal, you could do all of those things, but because we were servants of sin, none of that we did was a righteousness that was acceptable to God. Again, we'll talk a little more about that in just a moment. But what he's after is, there has to be a change with us. And so that's what Paul talks about in the next verse, verse 18. "Being then made free from sin, ye became the servants of righteousness." See, we were servants of sin. When we got saved, we became servants of righteousness. And the important point I want to make here before we read the next verse is that we see ourselves that way. That's important because that's who we were made to be. That's how God now sees us, as servants of righteousness. And you say, well, what if I don't always do righteousness? That doesn't change who you are. You may not be acting like who you are, but that is now who you are. And that's huge. And by the way, if you actually think about that, if you just sit down and kind of ponder your way through that, you'll understand that is the only way that you could ever do any kind of righteousness that God would accept. He has to change who we are. So He does. And so in order to get that, He made us free from sin, and He made us to be servants of righteousness. And by the way, that is an accomplished fact. That's not something we need to make sure happens. That got done apart from us. That was part of the salvation package. Everybody understand what I'm saying there? That is absolutely an accomplished, finished fact. Now, what we're supposed to do, remember we told a while ago, now you have a choice about who you're going to serve. You need to start serving as the servant that you have been made to be, servants of righteousness. Verse 19. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as you have yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. This is the verse we left off on last time, and yes, we did talk about this infirmity of our flesh. That is the natural tendency of the flesh to try to... Oh, I should have tested these markers out to see which one does what. That is the natural tendency of the flesh. The flesh wants to use the law to justify itself. I don't like that one. That's a little better, huh? And sanctify itself. That's what the and the law doesn't look. Can anybody justify themselves by keeping the law? Do you know that? But just like you know that, you need to also make sure that you know that neither can anyone sanctify themselves by their own efforts or by keeping the law. Neither one of those is going to happen. The reason people are objecting to what was back in verse 14 when Paul says we're not under the law but under grace, they think that is the only way in order to overcome sin. It's the only way to produce righteousness, because if we don't have a rule telling us what to do, how in the world will we do it? And so that's the misunderstanding. Now I want to skip you to another part of this verse. He says, I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of flesh, for as you've yielded your members service to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, that was before we were saved, even so now that you are saved, yield your members servants to righteousness. Now you remember what you were made to be in the previous verse? And now we are servants to righteousness. Actually, no, I got that wrong, because this is my point. We were servants of righteousness. And here he says, yield your members servants to righteousness. That little prepositional change makes a difference. It doesn't look like much difference, but does anybody spot what the significant difference is in that? What's the difference between being a servant of righteousness and yielding your members servants to righteousness? It almost looks identical. It is close, but what's the subtle difference that's important to understand?
Living in it.
Huh?
Living in it.
Okay, look, I think this is what you're saying. When Bud says living in it, servants of righteousness, that is an accomplished fact for you. That's who you were made to be. Done deal. Finished. You can't enhance that. But yielding your members servants to righteousness is the choice that you make about who you're going to serve. So when you talk about living in it, that's this guy right here. Servants to righteousness is how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. Servants of righteousness is who we are. So in verse 18, and that's what this is. Verse 18, that's who we are, no matter what we do. Verse 19, that's what we're supposed to act like, and that's not a guarantee. That's a choice that every one of us are going to make. And so, let's see. Now, there's one more thing about verse 19 that I want us to look at here. And this is the key to understanding that grace is able to do something that the law is not able to do. Because here's the thing. When you get ready to... Let's just put these two issues up here, because this is the context in this whole chapter, to overcome sin and to produce righteousness. What is the squeak? Is that okay? I'll use this one and see if it's any better. All right, is that better?
Yes.
You didn't hear that one, did you?
No, I didn't. You did it.
Okay. You want me to go back to the other one?
No.
Okay.
My ears were going, oh, my hair was just standing up.
Yeah, mine was too, Bertha. Okay. My hair was standing straight up with that squeaky. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's good. It's fine. Okay. So here's what the whole context is. How do we overcome sin and how do we produce righteousness? When Paul says you're not under the law, it's because he knows you can't do either one of these by means of the law. You'll have to do it under grace. So you have things on opposite ends of the spectrum here. So the thing that we have to understand is, what is it that motivates us? Now that's an important point here. What is it that motivates us to want to overcome sin when we're faced with a choice? Huh? Okay, Karen is saying the renewing of our mind. That's not a bad way to say that at all. That you're supposed to think about it differently. But let me ask the question a different way. Actually, I'm asking this rhetorically because I want to read the verse and do it. What is it that makes you? What is it about grace? If it's the law doesn't have any power to motivate you to want to overcome sin. The law just tells you what's right and what's wrong. Look, I hate to use this with the speed limit sign, but it's an easy illustration. Just because you see the speed limit you ever gone into Odessa where they're doing that construction and you drive along for miles and you're thinking, where is the construction? And they've dropped the speed limit down to 55 and they have that little flashing deal out there. And if you're going over 65, it goes red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, blue, and it just goes slow down. And then when you get to 65, it starts mapping your speed out, blinking, because you still need to slow down to 55. Does that give you a desire, a true want to just slow down? Okay, well, see, I actually put that in the note. She goes, no, the ticket. But the ticket is not the law. The ticket is the consequence for breaking the law. So is there anything in the law that just makes you want to go, oh, when I see that sign, I just naturally want to slow down. Yeah, I want to run over it. Right, okay. Look, this group, I knew this was a dangerous illustration to go in. Right. But you understand, there's nothing about the law that makes you naturally want to do that. Now, let's talk about sin, overcoming sin in our life. Is there anything about the law? When Paul says, I didn't even know about envy until the law told me about it. Is there anything about knowing that envy is actually something that God considers to be sinful? Is there anything about knowing that just makes you go, gosh, I just don't want to envy anymore. I'm not saying you don't want to please God. I guess now I'm running off the road into the weeds, so let me see if I can get this back. There is nothing about the law itself that motivates you to want to overcome sin. There is nothing about the law that motivates us to want to, instead of giving in to sin, to actually now choosing righteousness. There's nothing about the law that does that. Only grace can motivate us. But the question is, and this is where we left off, the question is, how does grace motivate me to want, to have a sincere desire to overcome sin and produce righteousness. Because not only is grace the only power to do that, the law has no power to do it, because the law is powered by our flesh. The law itself has no power. It's just we're using the best efforts of our flesh to try to keep that law. But now when you get to grace, there is something about grace that actually does motivate us to want to choose the right thing, to want to choose righteousness. And by the way, that righteousness, and I want to talk about that just for a second here, because the particular kind of, oh, well, here it is. It's on the, maybe I've got it on the next slide. Let's see. Yeah. He says, even so now, yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. That is a particular kind of righteousness. In other words, let me say it to you this way. God does not want... No, let me ask you the question. Why does God want you to produce righteousness? Why does God want any of us to produce righteousness? Why is that?
To demonstrate the power of His grace.
Okay, Bud says to demonstrate the power of His grace. That's good. What else? I'm sorry, Bertha?
To show God's love for every...
Okay, all right. You're showing God's love when you do that. What else?
For His glory and His dominance over the adversary.
Okay, for His dominance over the adversary. What was the first thing you said? That was His glory. That's true.
Robert keeps saying conforming to the image of His Son.
Conforming us to the image of His Son. Those are all good. I mean, these are great answers. You do realize that all these answers, if you went in just to the normal congregation, you wouldn't be hearing these kinds of answers. And I'm rejoicing in that. But the answer, there is another answer. And I'm not saying any of those are wrong that we've been talking about, but I want us to now see this other aspect. Because here's a man, you know, we talked earlier about here's a lost man, but he spends his life and he spends his fortune and he spends his time doing good in the world.
But He's not laboring with His Father.
No, he's not laboring with his Father. Not only, so far, he's on the opposite end of that. Even in doing those things, even though they're good things, he still is what? He's a servant of sin. It's all he can be. He's an enemy of God. He is unrighteous. He is under sin. He's alive unto sin, and he's dead unto God. Everything about him is wrong. You say, but he's doing good things, and that's the way the world looks at it. So we have to stop looking at it the way the world looks at it and look at it the way our Father looks at it. Because at the end, it's going to be the way He looks at it is how it's going to be. I have this little saying I used to live all the time. I have my opinion, and you have your opinion, and God has His opinion, and ours doesn't count. Because we are looking at it from the standpoint of His point of view. And so an unsaved man does righteous acts, and he does those because he thinks, number one, it may get him to heaven. Number two, it may get him to get God to bless him in some material way. Number three, he thinks that if he does good things, God will answer his prayers. You realize everything we're talking about here is performance-based. I'm doing something in order to get God to do something. That's right, it's works. It's a transaction going on there. But God is, and by the way, God doesn't necessarily look at those things that He's doing as evil. It is just a righteousness that He cannot accept. Because God is looking for a particular kind of righteousness. And that's it at the end of Romans 6:19. He is not looking at righteousness for righteousness' sake. He is looking at righteousness that is unto something else. He's looking at righteousness which is unto holiness. Now, when I say that, if that doesn't make alarms go off in your head or the light bulb come on or any of that, it's because when we went through this the first time, I didn't do a very good job of explaining the last two words of that verse.
Separate. Are you trying to say that grace, demonstrate grace by being dead to sin and alive unto God? Is that what you're...
Well, we have been made dead to sin and alive unto God, so we can live out of grace. And grace is going to motivate us to have a desire to overcome sin and motivate us, give us a desire to produce righteousness. It is the power by which those things can be done, but that grace also, in addition to all of that, produces a righteousness which is unlike the righteousness a lost man produces, because he cannot produce a righteousness which is unto holiness. Only a guy who is now a servant of righteousness, only he can produce that kind of righteousness. Now what I need to do is I need to talk to us about what that kind of righteousness is. What does it mean to have righteousness unto holiness? And by the way, that unto holiness aspect, that's the key to understanding how you get motivated by grace and not by the law. It's tucked in that phrase. But I'm going to have to show it to us, I know, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So, when he adds that, because see, couldn't he have just cut that off and said, even so now, yield your members servants to righteousness, period. But he added those last two words because that makes that different now. Because now you're being told about what it is about grace that actually motivates us. Well, it is a particular power, Karen, it is. Because when we went through holiness earlier, and I did it because I knew we were coming here. But when we got, and by the way, as far as the word holiness goes, we studied holiness because we're talking about, this is now talking about our sanctification. But this is the first time that holiness has shown up in Paul's epistle. We got righteousness shown to us back in Romans 1 through 5. No, but that's all correct. What you're saying is all right. What I want to do is I want to walk you through this in a way where you see this unfold. So to do this, let me take you to some verses. Because holiness, I'm going to paraphrase what Karen just said. She said, holiness is kind of the ultimate, okay? In other words, and righteousness, which is unto holiness, when God sees that, He's going, finally, that's the kind of righteousness that I'm after. That kind right there. But now let me just show this to you. I'm going to show you that, first of all, holiness is at the very core of who God is. It is His essential character. So we're going to turn to Isaiah chapter 6 and look at, I did that on the board, so I'm not going to do that for you. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and His train filled the temple. Above it stood the seraphims. Each one had 6 wings. With twain He covered His face, and with twain He covered His feet, and with twain He did fly. And one cried unto another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. And the post of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Now when those seraphim are saying, and in your notes, by the way, I put cherubim, but it was the seraphim. My mistake, so you might want to just mark that out and correct that. But it's the seraphim make that cry. They're talking about what is, when they say, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, they're saying that's who God is at His very essence. And so when Isaiah sees that event, you remember he's got a vision from the Lord. By the way, this is a glorious event. I mean, just when you see that, he talks about, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lifted up, and His train filled the temple, and the seraphims are around Him, and they're crying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And this whole scene is unfolding. Isaiah, when he looks at that, you know what immediately comes into his mind? Because if you know something is holy, what do you know? We studied this. There's two aspects to holiness. It's separated unto God for His purpose, for the purpose for which it was created. And the second thing is that it is considered by God to be absolutely clean, to be absolutely pure. Because if it's not usable by Him. Remember, we talked about the issue of a scalpel. It's not just good enough to have a scalpel. That thing has to be sterilized, to do surgery with it. Otherwise, what are you doing? You're introducing bacteria into the patient that's going to wind up killing them. So that thing has to be, it's not separated unto God, so it's not holy, but you understand, it's made clean, so it's usable. Well, so this thing is usable. When Isaiah sees this scene, he suddenly realizes how unclean he is. He's looking at God and hearing this declaration, and suddenly he's realizing, so let me read it for you. Verse 5, Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. When Isaiah sees the Lord in this vision, he suddenly realizes, I have no business being around this. I am absolutely unclean. Woe is me, I'm undone. I have to tell you, he understands this issue. He is actually getting a glimpse and a mental understanding of the very holiness of God. So by comparison, the very opposite of that which is holy would be that which is unclean. Do you see? And that's what I'm driving at there. So when God sanctifies something, or when He pronounces it to be holy, and by the way, those words come from the same word. I know they look different in English, but those two words come from the same word. Then you realize it is set apart for God's use, and it is clean and pure and therefore usable by Him. Okay, so when an Israelite was going to come to worship before the Lord, do you know what he did? He had to sanctify himself before he came. Now, look, I'm just going to sidetrack here. We don't live in Israel's program. You know that. We live in the dispensation of grace. But when you look back, did you ever wonder why? Look, let me tell the way it was when I was a kid, when I was growing up in the 50s. When I was growing up in the previous century. That sounds old, doesn't it? My mom would make me take a bath. I'd put on my best clothes. She'd make me shine my shoes, or at least get the dust off of them, comb my hair, And we'd all go to church that way. And do you know why? Because there was a mindset. It confused some things. It was honestly motivated, but it confused some things. Because when an Israelite went to worship before the Lord, he had to sanctify himself, to clean himself up. So you know what everybody did? Everybody thought, oh, well, you know what? Because it's along with that, we want to offer God the best of what we have. And everybody did that. But you know what that did? Now, was the Bible really talking about dressing up for church? That's not what it was talking about. But you understand, the Israelites, they didn't just come before God without preparing themselves. Under the law, that was different for them. So, I got to read another verse before we stop for this break. But he was going to come and he was going to make himself clean, and then he was going to present himself to the Lord. Take a look at this scripture, Zechariah 14:16. And it came to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, Zechariah, before we keep reading, Zechariah is talking about the way it will be in the world once Daniel's 70th week is over, the Advent has taken place, and now you're in the kingdom. And every year, it says, all those nations are going to come up and they're going to present themselves before the Lord on the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. Even though it's the millennium, there is going to be a punishment for those that are not going to come up and see the Lord every year. And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, that have no rain, he says that, look, he says, let's take Egypt for example. If they don't come up and God punishes them by not putting any rain on their country, if you understand the Greek, it says he moved them to West Texas. You might. That have no rain. He says, here's what else God will do. Next thing God will do is this. There shall be the plague, wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So it just won't stop with the drought. Now he'll introduce the plague. Verse 19. This shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. In that day shall there be upon the bells of the horses holiness, and by the way, that's the Bible's all caps. Holiness unto the Lord, that's the way it'll be written. And the pots in the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. Yea, every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness unto the Lord of hosts. And all they that sacrifice shall come and take of them and seethe, they're talking about the offerings there, seethe therein. And in that day there shall be no more the Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. Now, we can see that because of what's being said here, holiness is the issue that is front and center at that time. And in the kingdom, holiness is going to be the issue. Every year, they're going to be called to come up and present themselves before the Lord. And and the horses that lead the way in this procession are going to have bells on them, and it's going to be written, holiness unto the Lord. This whole thing has been prescribed here. Those bells, every time those horses take a step, those bells are chiming. And you know what they're chiming out? The holiness of the Lord. This whole thing is pointing to that. And that inscription is going to be seen by everybody that comes to the Lord's house on the Feast of Tabernacles every year. And when they get into the Lord's house, they're going to find some bowls that are in there, and they're going to see their offerings in those bowls unto the Lord. And every one of those bowls, it says, is going to be holiness unto the Lord. The only thing I'm trying to get to here is that holiness is a very big issue to God. It's not just big to Him now, it is always going to be big to Him. Now when we come back from the break, here's what we're going to look at next. God, because He is holy, wants to surround Himself with that which is holy. Because that which is holy is compatible with His character, compatible with His nature. It's like Him. It's conducive to what He is doing. It's usable by Him. He likes it. This is a terrible way to illustrate it, but it's the only thing that's popping into my head. I love the beach. Now, some folks like the mountains. Some folks like other venues. I love the beach. I love to hear the water rolling in on the shore. I love to be in the water. I like to walk in the sand. Except that sand that's been in the sun all day long, and that first layer of sand is like 200 degrees. You got to get your feet below the surface to actually get in the cool of it. I love to walk in the sand. I love the water. I love palm trees. I really like all of that. That's very serene to me. I see those shows where people move to the Caribbean islands and they're working from a cafe internet to do their... And I'm thinking, what do you do that allows you to do that? What could you possibly... So, I'm sure it is, because there they are. But I love all that. And when I'm around that, I like it. It's enjoyable to me. I just really... we even decorated one of our bedrooms in a Caribbean theme. I'm thinking about getting a recording of seagulls and playing it softly in the background. I love that whole experience. Well, that's how God feels about the beach. And He also feels that way about holiness. Okay, I don't know if He feels that way about the beach. But you know what? He's the Creator, right? So obviously He likes it. My point is, the way we feel about the things that we feel like, I not only feel at home here, I just want to surround myself with this. That's the way God feels about holiness. And so when we come back, I want to do two things. I want to take that issue of righteousness unto holiness and talk about what kind of righteousness is it that God looks at that kind of righteousness and says, that's what I love, and that's what I want to surround myself with. That's what I want around me. I know there are servants of sin that are doing their own righteous acts, but that's not a righteousness that I'm after. I'm after a righteousness which is unto holiness. That's the kind I'm after. So I want us to see that issue, and then we're going to pick up that question and say, so how in the world does how do we use grace to motivate us to produce that kind of righteousness? Here's how important this is. If you're living your Christian life any other way, you're not living it the way your Father intended you to. We've got to get this straight in our minds, because this is how important... I'm showing this whole thing to show you this is how important it is